Okay, in this video, we will discuss some of the different function of the brain lobes. So, this somatosensory and visual cortices. So we know that the somatosensory or sensory cortex is in the parietal region. Okay, the red area, primary somatosensory cortex. Now, this is a lateral view. This is a medial view. You see this, and the premotor area or the motor cortex is in the frontal lobe. This area is the premotor area, the movement which takes care of the movement, motor area. This is the lateral, this is the medial view, the motor area. And the lateral view again, so the Broca's area, that's on the lateral view of the frontal lobe. This is the Broca's area. So Broca's area is responsible for the speech production. Okay. And this is Wernicke area. Now this area is located again on the lateral side of the brain where the parietal and temporal lobe meet together. The lateral sulcus here. This lateral sulcus. This is a Wernicke area. Wernicke area is responsible to generate plans for meaningful speech. Okay. And now if the person have lesion on frontal lobe, let's say lateral aspect, the inferior aspect of the frontal lobe, this area, they might have Broca's aphasia, okay? And if they have on the temporal lobe, the lower trunk, they might have Wernicke aphasia. If it's both, then it's both kind of aphasia. Now we will discuss the cerebral artery dysfunctions. So middle cerebral artery, again, in this diagram, I'm just going to discuss the upper trunk of the MCA. So the upper trunk will cover the frontal lobe and parietal lobe, this area. It's the frontal and parietal lobe. So dysfunctions of either hemisphere, contralateral hemiplegia, especially of the face and upper extremity. Contralateral hemisensory loss. Okay, sensory, as I mentioned before, this is the sensory cortex. This is your motor cortex. The sensory loss of one side of the body. Okay, visual impairment. Okay, parietal lobe is also playing role. Parietal and temporal lobe are playing role with the visuals too. Ideation apraxia, lack of judgment, depression, field dependency. Now, if it's on the lesion is on the right hemisphere, it'll be left unilateral body neglect and left unilateral vision neglect. So remember, right and left hemisphere. Right hemisphere will work for the left side of the body. Left hemisphere works for the right side of the body. And then if it's the left hemisphere dysfunction, it'll be bilateral motor apraxia. Again, Broca's area, Broca's aphasia. Now, Broca area is on the dominant side of the brain. So let's say if I'm right hand dominant, my Broca's area will be on the left side. So if it's the left hemisphere, left MCA occlusion or frontal lobe, then you can predict that I have Broca's aphasia. Okay. So usually if I'm a right-handed person, my Broca's area will be on the left side of the hemisphere. Now, we discuss the MCA lower trunk. The lower trunk will cover the temporal and a little bit occipital lobe. Now, the possible impairments will be the contralateral visual field deficit. Again, a little bit visual field. The temporal lobe is important. The visual tracts are passing from there. Behavior abnormalities, visuospatial dysfunction. Now, if it's the left hemisphere, again, the Wernicke aphasia is on the left side. If I'm right hand dominant, my Wernicke area will be on the left side, and that will be affected. You see the parietal lobe, temporal lobe is occluded this side, and there will be my Wernicke area. And I'll be having a lot of problem with my speech, planning, or understanding sense. Now the MCA, both upper and lower trunk, okay, that will be a major stroke. The lateral aspect of the involved hemisphere, impairment related to both upper and lower trunk dysfunction, they are same as above. Like I mentioned all the deficits here, right? These deficits, They're all covered by, if it's the whole lateral side, you will experience the deficits that I mentioned about. Now, anterior cerebral artery, that is supplying blood. I'll show you the lateral view. This is medial view. Lateral view, I told you before, it comes, spills blood on the superior surface right here, superior aspect of frontal and parietal lobe. Now, there's a lesion. This function will be contralateral hemiparesis. It's a weakness, greatest in the foot. Now, as I mentioned before, there's a sensory, right? The sensory cortex and then the motor cortex. So it's gonna again affect the sensation. And there's a homunculus, which is I'll further discuss that in the next slide. Um, so just remember, if there's an ACA stroke, it affects mostly your lower extremities, your legs, your foot. Now, left unilateral apraxia, and inertia of speech, behavior disturbance. So anything with the frontal lobe can cause behavior disturbance and illusion because it's providing blood to frontal lobe also. Now, internal carotid artery. Again, internal carotid artery is the main artery that enters into subaquinate space and then divides into internal MCA and ACA. Now, the location, the combination of MCA artery, distribution of anterior cerebral artery. Okay. Impairment related to dysfunction of the middle and anterior cerebral arteries. All the symptoms that I mentioned before for ACA and MCA will be the symptoms if the internal carotid artery is occluded. Now, anterior choroidal artery is a branch of internal carotid artery, which goes to the globus pallidus, lateral geniculate body, posterior limb of internal capsule. So again, hemiparesis of arm, face, leg, hemisensory loss, and hemianopia. Now, posterior cerebral artery, it covers this part. The lateral surface is temporal lobe, occipital lobe. This is the superior part. Covers, I'm sorry, this is the lateral part, this is the medial part. In the medial part, you can see getting blood from PCA. So medial and inferior aspect of the right temporal and occipital lobes, posterior corpus callosum, and penetrating arteries into the midbrain and thalamus. This function will be anonymous hemianopia. We'll discuss that in the class in detail. Visual agnosia, a lot of visual problems because the occipital lobe is involved here. Memory impairment, contralateral numbness. Now, thalamus and hypothalamus are getting blood from posterior cerebral artery, right? So we might see memory and contralateral numbness also. Right-sided dysfunction will be cortical blindness, visual spatial impairment, impaired left-right discrimination. And if it's a left side dysfunction, finger agnosia, graphia, alexia. Now these terminologies, alexia, difficulty to read or difficulty to do math, so these are the terminologies I'll provide in the glossary again. But I highly suggest you guys read the terminologies. So if you have a case study and you see the symptoms, or if you see the terminology, you know what it is representing. Now, basilar artery. As I mentioned before, basilar artery supplies majority of the pons. Okay, and any dysfunction in basilar artery will result in dizziness. Okay, bilateral symmetric weakness and the paralysis of eye abductors. So very important. All the components of pons. If there's occlusion, there will be a lot of symptoms you can see from dysfunction. Now, basilar artery, the distal part. So before it was proximal, this is distal part. The midbrain, thalamus, and caudate nucleus. That's that location. So, papillary abnormalities, abnormal eye movement, altered level of alertness. Again, anything with the midbrain, right, is gonna affect your level of alertness. It might put you in the coma, memory loss, agitation, or hallucination. It's a very severe kind of stroke. Vertebral artery, that's the two main arteries that are coming up, and they supply blood to medulla, right, and cerebellum with their terminal branches. Now, if there's a stroke or occlusion of vertebral artery, that's going to be very, very dangerous, and the symptoms are dizziness, vomiting, and again, the cerebellum, the job of the cerebellum, if you remember that, the job of the medulla, what are the functions of medulla, we can understand. Like gait ataxia, well, that's from the cerebellum, right? We can identify the symptoms. If we know the function of each lobe and function of each structure, and then you get the case study that this client presents with occlusion of this artery and what are the symptoms, you will be able to identify. Now, this is the same thing. I put it in a little bit more explanation here. Aphasia, Broca's, Wernicke, and like MCA on the left side, MCA occlusion on the right side. Okay. Okay. And as we mentioned before in the table, the posterior cerebral artery, what are the occlusion, if there's occlusion, what will be the symptoms, the memory loss, visual perceptual deficits, visual field cut, very important part. Because the temporal lobe involvement and the cerebral PCA is supplying blood to occipital lobe also. So, and thalamus, and if the PCA is occluded, there will be dysfunctions with the thalamus and hypothalamus also. In the anterior ACA, we discussed that in the table format. It's a little bit more explained in this slide. The ACA is supplying blood to superior, lateral, and medial aspect of frontal and parietal lobe. The lesion of ACA may result in the contralateral hemiplegia and praxia, cognitive and behavior problems,